Hello, everybody, and welcome to Let's Talk Leadership with me, Charlie Swords. In August 2022, a McKinsey Health Institute survey of nearly 15,000 workers across 15 countries found that despite HR professionals making employee mental health a top priority, their efforts are falling short. On average, today, a quarter of employees report experiencing burnout symptoms. It's also estimated that 9 out of 10 companies offer a host of wellness benefits and wellness programs such as yoga, meditation app subscriptions, well-being days, and various related training programs. Now, while this is very helpful on an individual level to alleviate symptoms, the measures don't resolve the actual cause of employee burnout. And the survey suggests also that employers underestimate the critical role of the workplace in preventing and reducing burnout and in supporting employee mental health. So, to discuss the role of workplace culture and the leadership challenges in terms of preventing burnout, I am delighted to introduce you to my guest, Caroline Hughes, who is a highly accomplished global talent and leadership executive. Caroline is also ICF an accredited coach and a developer of leaders who are committed to their legacy from a place of authenticity. Caroline has also experienced burnout, and through her recovery, she has discovered that personal transformation need not come at the expense of a fulfilling career. So, Caroline, thank you for joining us, and I am delighted you can join me today, and I'm looking forward to sharing our insights.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. I'm really happy to be here because, I think the more people talk about burnout, we layer by layer, we remove the blame and the shame, because there's a lot of, you hear people saying, don't you, like, I'm afraid of burning out, but they don't really, well, they don't even know what it is and they don't even know what to do about it. I really welcome the conversation today.
And if they have experienced it, a lot of people are afraid to say that they were actually burnt out. So yeah, that sense of shame and guilt is still attached to it, and I think we need to try to eliminate that. So, Caroline, when it comes to workplace culture, recent surveys cite the lack of support for or recognition from leadership of the contribution and the well-being of employees as a key driver of poor workplace culture. But, the leaders as role models, as we know, are so overwhelmed themselves. It's a cascading effect. And they tend to consider the wellness programs a solution in and of themselves. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's kind of become normal now, hasn't it, for leaders to just bounce from crisis to crisis. Even you take the last 3 to 5 years, if dealing with COVID wasn't enough, and there's the war in Ukraine, there's rising costs, energy, global supply chain issues, and now we have market volatility, I suppose, re-entering our vocabulary again in recent times. So this kind of crisis as usual is very much part of the vernacular in organizations. Yeah, it's just become normal. And it is difficult, when that very primal part of the brain is activated, which really is fight or flight, it's really difficult to look outside of yourself and to be creative and to access innovation and empathy and all of these other, really, really good key critical skills. Because actually there's a part of us, I think that's inherent in all of us in this kind of crisis as usual, that's busy trying to get something done. Yeah. And so I wonder, is it helpful to try just talk a little bit about what burnout is and isn't in this context? Because there's a lot of people for whom, the high octane of the crisis as usual, the adrenaline rush, they're not impacted by burnout. This is something that they're well equipped to navigate through.
And they can manage it very well. Yeah.
Exactly. And very often those people who, it's not just as simple as saying they're very resilient. What I'm discovering through my work with clients and some recent research is it's people who have a very strong sense of self as well, very clear boundaries, and a very clear sense of their own kind of personal, place in the world. Because, and that's interesting to me, because we look at burnout through 2 lenses. So one is the WHO definition, which said that burnout is an occupational phenomenon. And I think that's the first time that burnout started to move away from the individual, that the McKinsey research that you cited at the beginning kind of points to, and looks at, well, what's actually happening in an organization for this to be, part, either it might be normalized if it's, so prevalent, or that maybe it's for a discrete few that somehow are unable to maintain the momentum and standard of a particular type of work environment. And I read a really interesting piece. There's a lady called Dr. Christina Masloch. I don't know if you're familiar with her research, but she was one of the kind of early adopters of this term burnout back in the 70s. And she talked about burnout kind of it's three forces coming together at the same time. The first, she said, is it's about exhaustion. It's simply, having run too far, too fast for too long, and the body steps into the conversation. So that's a very physical piece. The second is a cynicism. And this is like, this sense of disassociation from work that leads to a self-isolation, which means there's a withdrawal from not just from work, but from life, from activity. And that's the second kind of thread of burnout. And then the third is this feeling of being ineffective, that, we're accomplishing much less, and therefore we judge ourselves very harshly. And there's a cycle in this, too tired to do the things I used to do, disassociated and feeling I can't involve myself. And then why can't I involve myself? I used to be able to do it. Almost they're doing it, Yeah. And so sometimes stress is a synonym for burnout. And I think it's important to separate the two, because burnout really is compounded stress over time, where it has a physical and a mental.
The cumulative effect of stress.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's the mental component that starts, and the energetic component that starts then to get involved in the conversation, as I put it. So I think that's important first off, to just set the table in that way, that when we talk about burnout.
I think you're absolutely correct. And there's in terms of the three areas that you mentioned there, the second part, the cynicism, which leads to isolation and withdrawal. I believe that actually, another name for that's very common in today's world, is employee engagement, or rather the lack of it. And I think quite likely the employee disengagement can stem from burnout, or some of the symptoms being manifested in the individual. But I'm not sure that too many leaders are actually making that connection.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right, Charlie. And I think, there's a part of me that has huge empathy for leaders today, right? Because we've humanized it. If we look at what's happened in recent time, we have disassociated work from being a place to work really being the place in which it's most convenient and most conducive to getting a task done. And in that, particularly with hybrid work environments, it's easy to miss some of these cues of somebody who's withdrawing. But what we can become much more attuned to is, what about your very enthusiastic players, your highly driven individuals, typically the people we ask to do just the one more thing? Where are we watching their reactions to that? Because very often people are saying, I'd love to, but, or I've so many things on, I don't know how I'm going to get the time, have the capacity, or whatever that is. And it's like sometimes we just kind of, that's just seemed to be a reaction to a request, rather than what it could be, which is a signal of something maybe starting to wear out, to wear down.
And that kind of links, it aligns with, the old saying that we hear time and time again: if you want something done, ask a busy person. And I believe this has in the past and continues to contribute to the burnout. So what would your thoughts on that be?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a bit of a sensitive one for me, right? Because I definitely was the busy person who got asked a lot. And
I've been there. I know that, but It's
Yeah.
often easy. You're saying, oh, I have to show this person how to do something. So it's your options then in the mindset is I'll either ask the busy person because I know they'll get it done, or I'll do it myself. And then leaders contribute to their own overwhelm.
Exactly.
It's
exactly.
almost like a vicious cycle, really, isn't it?
It can be. It can be, you know, and I remember being with an occupational health specialist kind of during my own experience of burnout. And I was about 6 months in, and I really was I was kind of in denial that this could happen to me, because I just had energy to burn, or at least I used to have, and very ambitious and very, driven, and liked to produce a very high quality output, as indeed I still do. And there's something in the combination of that.
Yeah.
I need to be highly motivated and driven, and then over time kind of boundaries getting eroded around what's an acceptable amount of work to say yes to. And and I remember that occupational health specialist saying to me, you're a classic burnout candidate, because over time you haven't put checks and balances in place, and everyone around you is used to you saying yes. So even
so you were that proverbial busy person.
Busy person. Yeah. And I had busy people on my team who I also went, just one more thing.
Yeah, exactly. But it's self-perpetuating in a way. And I think maybe the key word there, Caroline, is self-care. That's a relatively new phenomenon for people in the work environment, where you really need to focus on your self-awareness, your self-care, your self-leadership. But we get so caught up in the doing and the going and that we actually forget. And sometimes it's a little too late when we have to pull back. Exactly. And then start looking back.
Yeah. And so here's the opportunity, right? So when we take that definition of it's the exhaustion plus the cynicism plus the disassociation and the judgment that goes with it, at any time when we see when we see those precursive signs, anybody can intervene. Any leader can intervene. Any well-thinking colleague or peer can go, are you okay? And I call it's having a well-being rather than a well-meaning conversation, because very often in the back of a leader's mind is, yeah, but the work's not going away, so how do I convince this person they're okay?
Yeah, that
because I landing back on my desk, like the boomerang.
Yeah, who else can I pass it to, almost? So, but this kind of brings me to the point as well here, where all leaders have a duty of care to every employee. Yes. So in addition to making sure that they have a safe working environment and they have the knowledge and the skills to do their jobs, the leader also has that extra responsibility and a moral obligation, really, to ensure the health and well-being of their employees is not adversely impacted by a huge and a growing workload, and the excessive demands. And we're all aware of the significant resourcing issues that are out there now. So how do you think leaders today are able to balance those two issues? So does achieving targets always need to override their duty of care?
I think there's kind of a false dichotomy in this kind of mindset, Charlie. I think, and it's not new, where is it productivity versus well-being? Is it get it done no matter what?
Or being busy, busy person but not productive. Yeah.
Busy, exactly. And there's a certain kind of almost an addiction culture of presenting a busyness as being a foil for for other things. And again, so if I look at this and say, okay, what does the research tell us, right? So we've talked about what burnout is. So what are the contributing factors to burnout? And again, Maslow has done some really great research on this, I think in conjunction with Gallup very recently, where they interviewed, I think it was 7,500 full-time employees. And they came up with 5 key drivers that can contribute to burnout. And in no particular order, what they established was 1, unfair treatment at work; 2, unreasonable workload; 3, lack of role clarity; 4, lack of communication and support from their direct line manager, which really points to some of your question, and 5, unreasonable time pressure.
Mm.
And what we often see is, while one of them might exist, when 3 to 5 of them exist over time, that's where, you know, it is the canary in the coal mine, you know, that goes in singing and beautifully yellow and then comes out dusty with no song.
Yeah.
We don't point at the canary and say, how did she make herself or himself sick? We go, my God, what's happening in that coal mine? Maybe that wasn't the right environment to put that canary in.
Mm.
So I think this is where the rubber hits the road. And even going back to your earlier point about, you know, wellness programs and apps, while they're very attractive tools and very essential tools to have in the toolkit and a good employee assistance program or other, you know, other tools, to some extent it's outsourcing the answer.
Oh, completely. That it's the solution.
The onus of the individual.
It's a tick box approach almost.
Yeah.
Go and have a yoga session, or, you know, there's more fruit being brought in, or you have your 15-minute massage. Now, while that's all beautiful, and I know I certainly have a massage myself on occasion, but it doesn't solve, it's not the cause, I'm not dealing with the cause. And
exactly.
This is where the culture is the issue. It's kind of like we put a sticky plaster on it. But we're not going to actually really, it's kind of like if we really acknowledge there is a problem within the workplace, then we have to take responsibility for resolving it. And I think this is where it gets stuck.
Yeah. And that takes time, and that takes effort, and that takes
it does. And I think we have also the situation, because I know from working with my clients all around and the training around assertiveness, at all level, including at leadership level, they're all saying they are afraid of saying no when they absolutely need to. And they know they're afraid that they're going to become burnout. But what's causing them to not say no is they're afraid of the consequences. Now, this is very sad in 21st century. So in terms of, you know, there seems to be a kind of it has evolved because the leaders themselves are overwhelmed. And it's almost like the overwhelm is cascading all the way down. And a leadership of fear seems to have crept into play, not consciously. So what would you advise leaders here in terms of, you know, observing how many of their employees are not saying no, how many of them are raising issues with them, and there's no resolution? The overwhelm is still, it's all coming down. It's not going up the line for resolution. And then ultimately at times you have a union rep coming in, or you have solicitors coming in to say things have got to change. So what is the advice for leaders here in terms of how can they initiate change even in their area of responsibility? It won't necessarily be the entire organization or group organization, but they do have some area of responsibility for their own team at least.
Yeah. There's a lot in what you're saying there, Charlie, in terms of, you know, one is how things are presenting as a consequence of this prolonged pressure over time, you know, and I do think it's important to say that, you know, there are people who thrive in that type of environment. There are people for whom that's positive.
So they really grow and develop on it.
Yeah, you know, and there is positive stress. So I think it's important to say this is not about kind of wrapping ourselves up in duvets and, you know, comfort blankets. But sometimes that's where the conversation, certainly that I'm in, go to. There's almost a fear of going to the other extreme, that we become somewhat soft, whatever soft might mean in that organization context. And like I certainly have loads of clients who don't want to be seen as a soft touch, that they need, because they need to drive hard and really struggle. And again, it's some of these almost false dichotomies that we've put in place. That, you know, I think there's a book called, what's it called? Doing Hard Things in a Human Way. And if you've come across this book, and it's really insightful about the role of courage, the role of, you know, having the courage to take pause when that is the right thing to do, having the courage to recognize what is being said, either in feedback, directly or through organization surveys and health checks and all of the tools that's available. Because one of the things that really interested me about the 4-day work week experiment that concluded there recently, where a lot of the organizations that participated said that in the beginning, it was trying to squeeze 5 days into 4.
Yeah.
Over time, some of them began to recognize actually it was about having really clear priorities about what was important and stopping doing some of the things that they simply always did, and that actually some of which had grown because of hybrid working, needing to be more inclusive of more people, and therefore getting invited to even more meetings than they were already, and recognizing that it was okay to not be involved in every moving part of the teamwork. So I think that's kind of a first message, really take a critical look at how is work being done here. What is it that is at the core of our work? Because if one of those 5 factors of overwhelm and burnout is, unmanageable workload, when we have to look at what's feeding into that, how are we prioritizing? How are we, as a leader, am I going to the busy person all of the time, or am I being inclusive of other talent on my team who may need a little more coaching and intervention from me, but actually has as good an opportunity as delivering on those particular projects or items as the person that might be my normal go-to.
Yeah, and that kind of, Caroline, I agree with you, because the issue that I think a lot of leaders face now is they're not aware of the other talent or the alternative talent on their team, that they don't know their employees well enough because of the constant doing. So, there's another great book, The E-Myth Revisited, where you, as a leader, you really have to step up out of the day-to-day, and you have to look back in at your team and at your business, at the organization. And there's also an element of the leader needs to trust that their people know what to do and trust them to do it. So to stop the micromanaging, and to sit with them and almost to become a coach in terms of how they relate to their employees, and just say, this is the workload, how do you think we can do it, or how we can achieve it, and to prioritize with them. So there's I believe there are a whole lot of techniques out there that can be used, but in a lot of it, the leaders are saying, I don't have time. And it's not about managing time. It's about what you're saying. It's about prioritizing. And really, no leader will achieve their results. They achieve on their own. They achieve them through their people. And yet the people are not really being brought into the discussion forum. So it's quite challenging.
I mean, on one hand, it is quite challenging. And on the other, it is quite straightforward also, because what do we know about organizations? The old adage, what gets measured gets done.
Exactly.
Or what gets measured gets managed. There's two.
Yeah.
Well,
you can't manage it if you can't measure it. Yeah. All the same nuance. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the same is true when it comes to really paying attention to employee well-being. And I feel like the conversation on well-being is a little bit like the conversation on diversity and on inclusion, back 10, 15 years ago, and indeed long before that, where everyone nodded and agreed and said, yes, of course it's the right thing to do. And of course we should have more. But not here. I don't have the time.
Somewhere else. It's a great idea for that department or that unit.
Yeah, you go first and see how it goes, and we'll, point and laugh and learn from your mistakes. But and I feel this is a similar kind of, almost, it's a point in time in the curve. And I think the longer that leaders look upwards and wait for something to happen kind of from on high, the more this is going to perpetuate.
Yeah.
So firstly, it's kind of choose your hard, right? It's hard to have time for everything. But are you ignoring the thing that ultimately is going to create time for you, that's going to reduce some of your mental bandwidth that's currently consumed with worry and concern for, is something going to happen or is someone going to fall over? So it's about kind of releasing that mental capacity. And I'm seeing more of this, Charlie. Maybe I'm a little bit more half full on this at this moment in time, because I'm beginning to see leaders really actively going, actually, we had to act in a certain way during the crisis of COVID, which typically is a little bit more command and control. It's a little bit more siloed to survive. And what I'm seeing, particularly in the last 12 months, is much more appetite to go, we need to bring people together. We need to talk about the things that really matter. We need to look at what is driving the level of our demand cycle. And from there, almost empowering leaders to actually speak and say for what's truly happening. Because on the other side of it, there is there's always a war for talent. There's a lot of reevaluation happening. Whether that's a great resignation or not, I think remains, certainly in an Irish context, remains to be seen across some sectors.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, when we talk about the hybrid work environment, during the pandemic, an awful lot of people who work from home actually found they became more productive and more focused. And they found that going back into the office actually rendered them less productive. So they definitely want to work in that hybrid environment. But then on the other hand, you have employees who found that they needed the structure of the office and they needed the direction and the guidance on a kind of a continuous basis. And that's, from a leader's point of view, it's how to manage that and how to improve their communication skills so that everybody is in the loop. Yeah. And that's an interesting thing. But the people I think who are getting a little bit forgotten in some of this post-COVID are the customers. Because if the processes and the procedures are not brought up to speed to reflect, the delivery out to the ultimate end user or patient or customer or whoever it may be, then that's a kind of a crippling factor as well. But in terms of the overwhelm of all of this, there's another phrase that absolutely, I have to say, it drives me to distraction. And I hear it so often from my clients, and it is the phrase is, well, it is what it is. And they're just saying, how do I respond to that when my boss says, it is what it is, just go and do it. Now, I find that tends to be a kind of an acceptance of the overwhelm of the culture and the practices. And I think it's a conversation stopper when, in actual fact, leaders and employees need to have a conversation. This is it, get on with it. And I think that's kind of also can be taken to be dismissive by the employee. It tends to be very damaging, and this is some of the experience that I felt. So how do you think this type of approach can be improved in terms of the leader who will apply these, cutting comments? Boom, this is it.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to edit it out, but that's just me. You mean
the phrase?
The phrase and the thinking.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you, but it's everywhere. It's in life as well as in a workplace situation. It just comes up everywhere. I can't believe it. It's kind of like, that's it. Boom. It is what it is. I think it's...
You see, so when I hear that with my clients, despite, my first reaction, because it's the modern day way of saying, this is how we do things around here, right?
Which is basically what culture is.
Right. But you see, in my work with clients, what I look at is, well, what is that phrase an expression of? Yeah. That is an expression of something being done to you. It's an expression of powerlessness. It's an expression of victimhood, of frustration. And I find when I start to use that language with leaders, it changes the way in which they identify with that phrase.
Yeah.
And rather than it being a catchy way to close down a conversation, and see it as that is their overt expression of powerlessness in a situation, and really have a conversation about, well, what does it mean to be an owner in this situation? What does it mean to really show leadership through whatever this is, whether it is temporary or ongoing, or something where you may well have a shared point of view of, look, I don't really like the way things are being done currently either. However, our job here is to make the best of it, you know, and you're probably this in a similar boat to me, Charlie, that very often this is where, as coaches, we get involved with our clients to help them see more opportunities where the horizon might look very grim or the end might feel much closer than it truly is. And it's really about looking at possibilities.
How not to use that phrase.
Yeah.
Because it's quite dismissive of the individual, and it's kind of going back to the older way of leading. Like, I'm the boss, and I basically, you do what I've said, and we're trying to, you know, we don't need to go back to that. We need to keep going away from it and into more modern leadership that's inclusive of all people, all individuals. So
absolutely,
yeah. I'm sorry, I'm very conscious of time now. So to kind of wrap up, to summarize, what advice would you give leaders today to help them to, first of all, to understand and observe the signs of burnout or potential burnout in their employees?
Yeah, so very simply, pay attention to what people are saying, but it's in the language that's been used every day.
Yeah.
You know, and again, I think there's a phrase, I don't know who it's by, you know, that is when your best employees go quiet, get concerned or get worried.
Yeah.
Really, really, the thing that you would rather kind of put to one side as being inconsequential, start to pay attention, get curious rather than judgmental. Because for someone to say, I'm not well, or I don't think I can do this right now, or whatever that phrase might be at the point in which, you know, there's really some intervention required. By the time it gets to that, it means that you have missed so many opportunities along the way.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a hard truth, because the signs are there if you're able to actually put them together, you know, and as they get curious rather than judgmental.
And if they don't, even when they don't get curious, I think this is what's leading to, I did a blog recently about rephrasing the Great Resignation to the Great Reset. It's causing employees to step back and rethink and reset their expectations of themselves in terms of how and where and when and at what they work. So there is a risk that they will lose the best.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the more employees stay connected, feel supported by their managers, because remember, that's one of those 5 factors. And maybe as a leader or a manager, you can't control whether or not there's more budget available or whether there's more people on your team, but you absolutely are in control of how supportive you are, how open you are for having any type of conversation that's needed, whether it's because you need to delegate work, or whether it's because actually there is a real struggle that it's time to identify. And I would also say, don't be afraid to say what you see. You know, there's a lot of, I don't want to go there in case I get sued, or I don't want to go there in case I say the wrong thing. You know, coming back to my point about choosing courage over comfort, you know you've chosen courage over comfort when, even if the conversation is difficult, you leave going, glad that happened, rather than you've driven home and you're putting the key in the door and it's still rattling around in your head and you feel you've missed an opportunity, whether you've fully grabbed what that might have been or not. You know, so I would say, you know, it's not about having the perfect conversation. It's about opening the conversation and listening. Listen, really listen.
And I think that probably is critical in every walk of life. Even at a personal level, you know, even at home, if you're all overwhelmed in work and you bring it all home with you, then you're not open to having those conversations at home either. So it really is, it's a multiplier, isn't it, really? And it's so sad in a way, because the simple things, the very subtle things like your observation, observe, listen. And it kind of comes back to, you know, that the role of the leader really is, in simple terms, to see, hear, and value their employees, and to have that conversation with them, and to be able to speak with them. And it'll improve the burnout situation, the engagement situation. It'll improve so much. But and finally, then, what advice would you give them to initiate change in the workplace culture to prevent burnout? So do you think they should wait from on high, or should they progress their thinking on high, or should they start taking action within their remit, their area of their remit?
I think it's an and, Charlie, but I would say, you know, our hardest work is the work that we do between our own four walls.
Yeah.
So that applies whether that's our relationship with ourselves, with our teams, and then broader into our organizations.
Yeah.
So whatever you can do locally to improve the work environment, you know, and it may be things like, you know, go back to the 5: workload, level of demand, level of support, level of connectivity, and fairness. You know, it's always worth taking time to examine that at your team or division or department level.
Yeah.
And being a proof of concept, if nothing else.
Exactly.
Being a data point. Because, you know, very often when we say go upstairs or go on high, that's more powerlessness. Whereas I'm really in the business of empowering leaders to actually deal with the circumstances that are there. And if that's a data point of here's why we need different resource pool, or here's why we need X amount of, you know, whether that's resources or budget or whatever it is, use it as the data, having gone and actually done something first, rather than, you know, be on the receipt of either a strategy at an organizational level that may or may not fit, or that will struggle to fit within your team. We kind of forget in the waiting game that actually there's loads of things that we can do locally. We can, you know, we can do strategy sessions. We can take those 5 factors and measure them on a scale out of 10. Like, this is really simple stuff. And let's look at, okay, where are the pressure points? Is it actually connection and belonging more so than workload? And it's the absence of that that's feeding a narrative of, I don't belong here, this isn't fair. You know, that's as much a factor. So because it's not
connectivity, as much as the overwhelming workload. Yeah.
You know, it's the same as assuming if somebody leaves, it's because of better pay.
Exactly. You know, and that may not be.
Story, but you know, people leave people. So get curious and really get laser focused on what are the things that I can do given the conditions I operate in, because there's always additional possibility. That will build trust with your teams. That will give you a sense as a leader of, I am doing something. And I would not underestimate that. And it gives also an opportunity for your team to get involved and to maybe have conversations that they might not normally be in. So I'm a big fan of, you know, doing consistent steps over time that will actually gradually improve things, or will gradually improve connectivity, belonging, fairness, if workload is something that is not going away. So how do you pull the other levers?
Well, exactly. So you have to do everything else then to manage this. And with the workload, there's always a customer or an end user directly linked to that workload. And in some cases, so if you look at the medical environments and that, you know, the decisions could be a matter of life and death. So in those situations, you really need to have your people working as one. And, you know, so it is mission critical. It probably, in fairness, is about the leader actually taking time to step back and to consider their mindset, their own mindset, in terms of how they've been thinking about all of this up to now, and saying, okay, you may have served me well up to now, but going forward, something needs to change, and the change has to really come from within. And so it's to go back, look at themselves first, and then when they make that change to themselves, I mean, you can't change other people and their behavior. So the leader has got to go back in, change their response, their behaviors, to influence a change in their employees. So it's about really stepping back and taking time to really look,
Yeah,
what can I fix or what can I address in the bigger picture? It's not just about the workload.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I'll give you the last word on that, Charlie.
What can I say? Listen, Caroline, it was absolutely great speaking with you. The time flew by. And I must say thank you very much for sharing your experiences and your insights. And I do believe actually that the listeners will find great nuggets in here. And hopefully for those of you who are listening, I hope you found the conversation of value. I believe you will. And if you'd like to discuss anything you've heard here, just get in contact with me directly, and we'll look after you. So, Caroline, thank you again. A pleasure as always chatting to you, and I wish you well in sunny Portugal. And to everybody else, thank you all very much, and have a great day.